If you've been watching my reviews for a while, you've probably noticed that I talk a lot about characterization. To me, a story lives and dies by its characters. I would rather watch interesting characters do a mundane thing than mundane characters do anything, and I think most people would agree with that. In my mysterious Ne'er-do-well review, I spent some time going in-depth about one scene in particular. This scene was so powerful and well-written that I described it as making the character complete. But she's not the only cast member who has a really deep and profound character moment like this. In fact, all of the 6 main characters each have more than a few. Some of these scenes are very blatant and obviously significant, even if not everyone can articulate why, while others are subtle enough that you might not grasp their significance upon first viewing. And some are so subtle that they're practically blink and you'll miss it, but nevertheless, they confirm things about the character in a way that fleshes out their personalities and provides a greater sense of context for everything we already knew about them. These are scenes that shed light on why a character's personality is the way it is, and all at once implies a lot about where they've been and where they're going. They make the character seem more complex and human, and even without thinking about it or putting it into words, you might find yourself struck with the feeling that you understand the character better, or possibly even relate to their feelings in a way that you couldn't before. I'll give you an example of what I mean, from something unrelated to ponies. Honestly, what would you people do without me to broaden your cultural palette? In the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, there's an infamous and classic scene with Ferris's depressive best friend Cameron. If you've seen the movie, you probably know what scene I'm talking about. The great thing about this scene is how subtle it is. Using only images and music, it tells you something about the character that's almost more than words alone could convey. Cameron lives with an overbearing and emotionally abusive father. It's already apparent that he's neurotic and completely unhappy, but until this point, it's mostly played for comic relief. It's not until this scene that the viewer is jarringly forced to stop laughing at him and start empathizing with him. Cameron, Sloane, and Ferris are at an art exhibit, but while Ferris and Sloane are off being romantic together, Cameron stands alone, staring forlorn at a precise point in a painting. The camera zooms closer and closer on the child walking with her mother, interspersed with shots of Cameron's pitiful expression. Eventually, the camera zooms so close on the child that it becomes unrecognizable, as Cameron is becoming lost, not only in the painting, but in his own neglected loneliness. Without a single word of dialogue, everything that Cameron is feeling is put front and center, and his sad plight is no longer a joke. It becomes apparent that the title of the movie is a red herring, and Ferris himself merely a catalyst. Cameron is the main character, and the emotional core of the film. While Ferris is someone that we can laugh with and admire, Cameron is someone that we can relate to and root for. All it takes is one good scene to completely change our perspective of a character, and in My Little Pony there are quite a few scenes like this. The Rainbow Dash scene on the cloud is one of them. In just a few simple lines, Rainbow Dash's innermost feelings, motivations, and fears are confirmed for us, and after seeing this side of the character, everything she does and everything about her personality comes into focus and makes a lot more sense. Now, I'm not a writer for television, so I don't claim to know everything about everything when it comes to the subtle nuances that no doubt go into writing a coherent character arc in a 22-minute window that manages to build upon all the previous 22-minute arcs without contradicting them, but I do know what's good, and I know what's really good, and I know what I like when I see it. Effective character development can happen at any speed. Sometimes it's subtle and slowly takes shape over a long time, and sometimes it happens all at once. That might sound worse, but not if it's well written. These are the scenes that believably enhanced our understanding of the main characters, either by affecting their growth or simply by revealing things about them that hadn't been shown before in a way that doesn't feel shoehorned. I'm going to be examining some of these important scenes and character moments for each character. Some of them are pretty obvious, but others you may have missed or not thought about. There is a ton of good character development over the course of this series. It's one of the show's greatest strengths, so to talk about every single noteworthy scene would be impossible, but I'm going to try to at least get through all my personal favorites. I already spoke at great length about Rainbow Dash in the Ne'er-do-well review, so let's skip her and start with Pinkie Pie. I would dare to say that Pinkie Pie has had by far the broadest character development and most growth of all the main characters. She's had a large number of episodes built around her, and by sheer happenstance, most of them just so happen to be exceptionally well written. Every single Pinkie episode contains at least one moment that says something meaningful about the character, either by revealing a new layer or adding one. But if I had to put my finger on one scene that really puts the character into perspective, it's a pretty obvious one. The Smile, Smile, Smile song from Season 2. In these 4 minutes, we are shown absolutely everything important about the character's personality and motivations in crystal clear detail. She had always been comic relief and even had some darker moments, but in this scene, a couple of very important things about who she is and her way of thinking are finally spelled out for the viewer. 1. We learn that Pinkie's antics and sense of humor come less from a need for attention and more from an earnest desire to spread positivity and make people happy. This distinction instantly makes her a lot more likable, as before this point you could be well justified in assuming the opposite. 2. We learn that Pinkie understands melancholy and loneliness. The line, "It's true some days are dark and lonely," is an admission on her part that even she isn't always in a cheery mood, and might even have days where she doesn't feel like getting out of bed, same as anyone. It's true she had expressed minor disappointment and even outright depression in previous episodes, but in Party of One it was played mainly for laughs and presented more as a uniquely circumstantial psychotic break than something she was used to dealing with. In a way, it almost made the character seem more irrationally cheery, because it implied that she didn't know what to do in her downtime and needed constant stimuli. The fact that momentary loneliness and fear of her friends not liking her would cause her to instantly snap makes it seem like this is the first time in her life she's ever had those emotions and doesn't know how to handle them. It worked well for that particular episode and is a memorable moment, but in terms of character development, it didn't accomplish much more than making the character seem unstable. Here, though, she shows a much more adult understanding of these kinds of emotions. You can take it either as an indicator that she has grown from the experience in Party of One, or that she's always understood these feelings, and that her reaction in that episode is something that more or less is always under the surface, and only the idea of losing the closest friend she'd ever had was simply the straw that broke the camel's back. But either way, the implied admission that melancholy is not unknown to her goes a long way toward making her relentlessly cheery personality seem less alien and more relatable. 3. Immediately after the dark and lonely line, we're treated to a nice visual metaphor of Pinkie helping herself out of the darkness and into the sun, set to the line, "Pinkie will be there to show you that it isn't that bad," which is immediately followed by the line about making her friends smile being the one thing that makes her happy. There's nothing subtle about this. The song is flat out telling you that making other people smile is the only thing that makes Pinkie able to face the day. The animation during the line about being there to show you it isn't that bad makes it abundantly clear that she's just as much talking to herself as she is the listener. Even if the viewer isn't thinking about it, they now instantly understand that even when Pinkie is in a bad mood, she still does her best to remain positive and make people smile, because seeing that she can have that effect on people warms her heart enough to genuinely put her in a good mood, even if she wasn't in one before. Pinkie Pie lives to cheer people up because doing so is what cheers her up, and without that, she's prone to despair. This goes back to what I said in the Meritua review about the characters being designed so that their greatest strength and greatest weakness are one and the same. And that's a theme that you'll notice in most of the scenes I talk about in this video. Pinkie having a very frightened, lonely, and sad side to her personality is often taken to extremes by the fandom, but it really is a vital part of her characterization, because knowing that Pinkie has the same fears and anxieties as everyone else makes her normal silliness less grating, and the knowledge that she has dark days recontextualizes her desire to make others happy. Her weakness becomes her strength. There's a pretty obvious pattern here, and it goes back to what I was saying before. Pinkie needs laughter, like Dash needs loyalty, like Fluttershy needs kindness. And you could say the same for AJ, Rarity, and Twilight, respectively. The characters' elements aren't just what they exude, but also what they need to receive in order to be happy. They're not fountains or generators of these traits, but more like amplifiers. They each absorb something from their friends and give it back to them. It's a give and take, baby! In a sense, this scene is the reconciliation of the character traits that were first revealed in Party of One and have continued to be present and expounded on throughout the series. Since Party of One, the show has gotten more and more mileage out of exploring the idea that Pinkie Pie is prone to extreme disappointment and bouts of depression. In fact, it's been done so often now that the idea of Pinkie Pie having a deeply buried Pagliacci-like sadness to her can no longer even justifiably be called a headcanon, as the show has pretty blatantly and consistently hinted at it by continuing to use the deflating hair visual and showing her in this state of despair more and more often. The most blatant example of this is in Maud Pie, where she sinks into that despair and defeatedly retreats inside right as the show cuts to commercial. And when it returns from commercial, it's the next morning, where Pinkie Pie shows up at Twilight's door bouncing and wearing a veneer of cheeriness, despite the fact that she's clearly still upset and not thinking clearly, as evidenced by her insane and desperate obstacle course idea. What this says to me is that Pinkie Pie's positive attitude is something that she has to psych herself up for, sometimes even donning it like a suit of armor in the hopes that the smiles she gives will be returned to her. Because seeing those smiles, and knowing that she put them there, makes her feel as good on the inside as she's projecting on the outside. By the time Maud Pie aired, this was not so much a huge revelation as it was additional confirmation of what had been more or less confirmed by the lyrics and animation of Smile, Smile, Smile. The fact that these character traits were already confirmed in that episode doesn't make it any less important when shown and expanded on in future episodes. On the contrary, characterization wouldn't be characterization if it wasn't consistently shown and put in the spotlight from time to time. But I digress. While these ideas and reevaluations about Pinkie's characterization were first introduced and hinted at in Party of One, and slightly expanded upon in Baby Cakes, they were never truly put into perspective until A Friend Indeed and Smile, Smile, Smile. The confirmation, culmination, and cohesion of these characteristics go a long way towards making Pinkie Pie more likable, relatable, sympathetic, and three-dimensional. Moving on to another character, the same can be said of Rarity's song, Art of the Dress, and indeed, the entire episode it's from, Suited for Success. Up until this point in the series, Rarity hadn't been fleshed out as much as the others, and for all intents and purposes, played the role of the generic girly one who's into fashion. Even her element might have seemed tacked on and ill-fitting at first, until this episode put it all into perspective and reconciled it with the rest of her personality in a way that made sense. In episode 14, all at once we're shown just how deeply Rarity's generous nature goes, as well as just how seriously she views herself as a creative. The episode's conflict shows us how her greatest virtue can also be her biggest hurdle, and the song shows us how passionately artistic she is. Suited for Success is where Rarity becomes Rarity, as opposed to just the girly, waspy one that likes dresses. Fluttershy is an interesting one because her biggest and most important character moment came extremely early in the series, right here in the second episode. All of the main characters have little segments in this episode showing off the element they exemplify, but Fluttershy's works particularly well because it directly complements a part of her personality that we had already gotten to see. At this point, Fluttershy had already been established as someone who is pants-shittingly terrified of social interaction. But when the gang is confronted with a vicious manticore and prepares to fight, suddenly the shyest and seemingly most cowardly character is able to perceive that kindness is the solution. This one small moment, right at the beginning of the series, tells you literally everything you need to know about this character. Coincidentally, I think one of the reasons people make the mistake of thinking that Fluttershy never learns anything and finds some of her episodes repetitive is because we learned virtually everything we need to know about the character halfway through the pilot. Fluttershy does evolve as a character over the course of the series, but the fact that we understand so much about the character so early on makes it seem redundant. We very slowly watch Fluttershy evolve from a cripplingly shy recluse who can barely converse or function to someone who, while still naturally introverted and meek, has learned to love and respect herself, take pride in her talents, stand up to bullies, and even has a close circle of beloved friends. Cutie Mark Chronicles does a great job showing the experiences that shaped her personality, and is one of the more memorable flashbacks of the episode. The idea that she was tormented as a kid and found solace with the animals on the ground puts everything we already knew about her into perspective. We've already been shown that she's fearful of other people, sensitive enough that she crumbles when pushed around, loves animals, feels the need to protect and care for the weak and victimized, lives on the ground, doesn't like heights, and has a frightening amount of pent-up rage. And in this short flashback sequence, all of that prior information is given context. It's not a moment where she grows or develops, so much as a moment where we learn more about her. But going back to moments that showcase her ongoing development, one of my favorite examples of her evolution is in Putting Your Hoof Down, where she attempts to flirt with the guy selling cherries.
Oh, hey, Mr. Handsome. I know you want to do the right thing because you're handsome and strong, and big, handsome, strong guys are always nice to every pony, right?
Gee, Fluttershy, you trying to buy a cherry or get rid of one? I like this scene because even though she's really awkward and bad at it, the point is she's doing something that the Fluttershy in the pilot would never do. In the first few episodes, she acts like a rape victim. She's barely able to introduce herself. And yet here she is, not only initiating a social interaction, but actually attempting to be charming. A for effort. She's still a dork, but she's come a long way. It's a pretty big indication that her time having real friends has boosted her confidence substantially, and that she's growing as a person. By season 3, she's able to show backbone and stand firm against a personality as domineering as Discord. And by season 4, she's confident and comfortable enough around her friends to openly disagree with them on important issues, perform in front of them, and even interject herself into a heated argument, successfully diffusing the situation, I might add. Another thing I like about putting her hoof down is how Fluttershy learning to say no to people hasn't been forgotten.
I said...
You son of a bitch! Why? Tell me why!
I said before that I think Pinkie has the broadest range of characterization out of the main 6, but I think Fluttershy's has been the most realistic. It's been very slow and very subtle, but it always sticks. There's rarely a moment when Fluttershy drastically evolves all at once, but she's sort of always evolving. Like she says in Philly Vanilli, baby steps.
I swear to God, that'll stop your heart!
Twilight Sparkle is the main character of the series with the most vague element, and as such, most of what we learn about her has to do with a slow-burning 3-season arc, the culmination of which is Magical Mystery Cure, where she masters the element of friendship magic and becomes the princess of friendship magic. It makes sense in terms of her element. She's the de facto leader of the group and the catalyst that brought them all together as friends in the first place. I've said before that I interpret a big part of her element to be empathy. Having something as vague as friendship as her element essentially means that the virtue she represents is in her ability to understand her friends and absorb all of their virtues to be the rock-solid foundation that keeps the circle of friends together. Without her, they have no center and would probably drift apart. In this episode, we see her friends falling apart without her, until she once again sets things right with the power of friendship, i.e. empathy, by reminding her friends exactly who they are and who each other are. Even though I hate this episode because the plot point about the changing cutie marks makes no fucking sense when you think about it, the thematic element of it at least is solid. It shows exactly what it means to have friendship as Twilight's element. Her cutie mark, after all, is a 6-pointed star, and I think the symbolism there is pretty self-explanatory. It also doesn't skimp on the magic part of it, as the entire episode is about a spell gone wrong, and then being rectified with empathy and friendship, and culminates in Twilight getting a bit of a magical upgrade in the form of a toy commercial. Say what you want about the decision to turn Twilight into an alicorn princess, but regardless, it made for a fitting end to one arc, and in Season 4 proved to be fertile ground for new Twilight stories and further development. While Mystery Cure makes for a good explanation of her element, it's a very slow build-up to this point, and while Twilight's triumphant ascent to princesshood is satisfying in a narrative sense, that's only half of her character. It certainly isn't perfect, and bringing it up as the sole example of Twilight's character development does a disservice to the character. Twilight is the main character of the show, and the newest princess, but there's a great deal more to her than that. You have to show the character's weaknesses too, or else you run the risk of morons viewing the character as a Mary Sue. Magical Mystery Cure had a lot crammed into 22 minutes, and didn't really have time to explore Twilight's flaws. But it didn't really have to. It was more about the culmination of her journey as a character, and the personal struggles that come as a result of her apprenticeship to Celestia and devotion to magic. If you want to see the more specific traits of her personality that work towards making her more relatable and understandable, well, you have the entire first season for that. The series has always had episodes focusing on each of the main characters, but people forget that the entire first season was told more or less from Twilight's perspective, and was less about the other characters as it was about Twilight learning about the other characters and us learning about them with her. Season 2, Episode 5 was the first episode where Twilight officially took a backseat. Between that point and the Season 3 finale, there was little left to be said, and Twilight's development was put on hold to give the other characters a chance to catch up and be fleshed out more. But up until that point, Twilight had been by far the most fully realized and dynamic character. Throughout all of Season 1, and the very first episodes of Season 2, we are constantly being shown new quirks, both positive and negative, about Twilight's personality, in addition to the friendship lessons she internalizes based on the experiences of her and her friends. In the very first episode, we immediately learn that Twilight is an introverted, antisocial shut-in, though not as bad as some people. We also learn that she doesn't really have any friends or even understand what she's missing out on, and prefers her hobbies and studies to social interaction. Actually, if you're interested in writing at all, the first episode could probably be watched and analyzed as a great example of how to introduce and define a character's personality from the get-go in a way that is immediately understandable as well as multifaceted. Not only are we immediately shown Twilight's studious and asocial tendencies, we're also shown that she's very sarcastic, paranoid, worrisome, socially awkward, easily annoyed, headstrong, but ultimately good-hearted and well-meaning. It's pretty impressive that all this information about Twilight's personality is relayed to us in the first 22 minutes of the series. Shortly after that, we have Ghostbusters, in which we are shown yet more aspects of Twilight's personality. We learn that she's modest and extremely concerned with how people perceive her. This new information instantly seems to make sense and fit in with what we already knew about the character. As a hand-picked student of the greatest royal authority, it makes sense that she'd be so fearful of scrutiny and jealousy, and so careful not to seem ungrateful or braggadocious about the extremely rare opportunities she's been afforded. Feeling Pinkie keen shows just how analytically and scientifically minded she is, as well as reaffirming her frustration at things outside her knowledge or control. And Lesson 0 goes all the way to the most cartoonishly exaggerated extremes to illustrate to us in no uncertain terms just how much tremendous pressure she puts on herself and how much she hates letting people down. It's a showcase of her greatest weaknesses, her paranoia and neuroticism, but also shows how those traits stem directly from, or perhaps are responsible for, her greatest strengths, her diligence and eagerness to learn. A lot of people complain about this episode being too exaggerated, but I think it was necessary to really go all out to the very limits of Twilight's neurotic paranoia and overactive imagination, because after a year of learning lessons, it was important to show that she can still very much buckle under pressure, and that certain core struggles of her personality will always be a part of her. Otherwise, she would start to look like a Mary Sue. And finally, we come to Applejack.
I didn't learn anything.
I'm grounded in horseshoes.